G'day, welcome back. This is the next video in my series on corresponding squares. I realize I hadn't done one for a while, and that's not for a lack of material. So far, we've only just scratched the surface. What I thought I'd do today is go back a little bit in time and actually try and fit Philidor into the conversation. Now, I think it's fairly clear Philidor didn't really think about it in terms of corresponding squares, but if we could find a pawn endgame with corresponding squares could be applied, well, that's good enough already. So, and you can see I found that position on the thumbnail, which is one of his studies, although I've flipped it. Okay, Philidor, go to the capture screens here. He needs very little introduction. He was late 18th century in France, 1726, 1795. You can see that. Well known as a musician, as well as being associated with the French royal court. And I mean, you can read this at your leisure, right? But he played chess and then became widely regarded as the best chess player in the world at the time, and spent time in France and then in England towards the end of his life when he'd been sort of on the proscription list, I guess you'd call it, in France. And he's also, I guess, he's most famous. He's written the book. He's written some operas, by the way. You can see he wrote 20 opera comédiques. And then his famous book is the Analysis of the Game of Chess, where he came up with many famous quotations. This is the one people most likely know: the pawns are the soul of chess. Okay, so that is Philidor. And then what I did is I went to the Harvard's website, great website, check it out. And here's the book just mentioned. Actually, you can download this book on internetarchive.org. It's quite quite disappointing in some ways because it's just a lot of text. But anyway, and then this is the position I chose from Harvard. So that's supposed to be in that book, and it's a position which you can see it's kind of a pawn endgame. Kind of you can see that you get that sort of the pawns aren't locked, but you get the theme. There'll be certain positions where there'll be corresponding squares, and because my bit of chess software is a bit dumb, I've flipped it so that I can run the analysis when you'll see it on the capture screen. And that's the position we're going to look at. I wouldn't be surprised if Philidor did more pawn endgame studies. I might do a bit more digging, but the problem is when you Google Philidor, it's almost impossible to screen out the other stuff he's associated with. Philidor position, rook endgame, of course, a Philidor opening, of course, right? And he's got that Philidor mate as well as other mate. So it shows up in so many other ways that you can't actually, I couldn't isolate the search. This is a position I say I flipped it and I've put this as white to move. That doesn't make a difference. So basically black has got to draw this position. He's 2 pawns down. How does he draw it? And that's what we're going to go into. Before we do that, I might just quickly run my other little bit of code. Let me bring that across here. You can see here's I just had this simple little sort of CSV file putting together with all the people we've looked at: Van Zuylen, Walker, Horwitz, Kling, Centurini, Dotina, Reichhelm, Lasker, so on, and that'll fill it all at the front there, right? And then I run the code, and I should be able to display where he fits in. It's getting a bit big nowadays, but see what you can see there. You can see good Philidor very early. This is Van Zuylen guys very early actually. I found that quite fascinating. And then almost a bit of a gap. We'll try and fill this gap in with some other people who've done pawn and game studies because it doesn't seem right that this period's empty. And then later on, the second half of the 19th century, Centurinis, Walkers, and Dotinas, and so on. Right. So just build that up, and then maybe there'll be other people that try to associate people together, people in Genoa, the Pleiades, and so on. There's a few names which we can sort of put in certain sort of schools, I guess is the right way of looking at it. But there's where Philidor stands alone and early on, which is what I was trying to get at. Here's the position we're going to look at, and we're going to do our normal sort of analysis process here. What's the key square? And okay, so we play King F4, and then we've got the studied position. And now we can start sort of plotting things out. Key square, think about where the key square is, but I think it's there. If white ever got there, he's going to get the black pawn or advance his own pawn. So that's the key square. And then you can start thinking about there are certain squares blocked out. You look at the E4 square, square number 1. Black's got to be able to answer king to E4 with his king to E6. Okay, and then now it's all about access to the key square number 1, and then you can see that white can get there from these 2 squares. So then basically you've got 3 matching squares, and you can see how that works. Everything nicely covered. You can't see it anymore because it took it away, but on the Arva's page, drawing movies King E2. And obviously, that's the only move. So you've got to stay on the key square mark number 2. In some ways, you kind of think that's the end of the position. And then in the continuation, which Philidor gives E4, basically giving up the tempo, and then the pawn positions have changed, but actually it doesn't make a lot of difference. We'll go into that position later. But what I want to do here is something which I found quite curious, is there's another way white might play this. Let's see how it goes. We just stay in our squares. We've moved back to E2. I say, always got to think about those extra sort of triangulating type squares. And there's quite a remarkable occurrence here that there's only one drawing move here, by the way. So when we go to E2, okay, so one thing you have to be able to move on to a square mark 2, but actually there's also this extra requirement. You've got to actually move up to the E6 square. King E6 is drawing, and then various lines are possible. Because what's going to happen now is, let's just continue. Let's say we go to D3, which is the point I'm thinking about. You're moving D3. Black can either take the E5 pawn off, or he can play king to F5 and go for the pawn on G5. But if you remember earlier, I'd marked these squares as not accessible. But that doesn't mean there's a way around the outside. So let's do a bit of pawn counting here now. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, doesn't really matter. 7, 8, 9. Okay, so now let's see what black can do. Let's say black just goes for the pawn. You can also take the E5 pawn, but let's go for the G5 pawn. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Okay, you can see the point there that with a white to move, they will promote at the same time. So you might even think that even if black was on E7 in this position, then he'd still be able to do it, because rather than promoting just before white, he would promote just after white. But let's have a look. When white goes to E2, black doesn't go to E6 like he should. It just stays behind. But have a look at what happens here. King moves to D3. And now the problem is black cannot move up to E6, because then white would play king to E4. So the problem is that by being passive, black actually loses 2 tempos, which means it's just game over. And anyway, king E6 and grabbing the E pawn looks like the most logical strategy for black anyway. But it was just interesting, this threat of a counterattack around the queen side. Always got to bear in mind when you're looking at these sort of corresponding square type positions. Okay, so that was the first sort of position within this Philidor study, and then we start looking at the variations where white pushes one or the other of his pawns to try and create a breakthrough. So let's look at those now. So rather than trying king to E2, we're just going to do the move which Philidor gives, which is pawn to E4. And 2 moves draw here, actually, either king E6 or king E7. You can just see how white no longer has any access points. So let's go with the line in Aves. She's the king move up to E3 or E6 in this case. And we guard our pawn on F5. That'll make sense. And basically, you can see the formation's the same. We basically drop back onto one of our squares, mark 2. So actually didn't have as much impact on the corresponding squares set up as I thought. We push our pawn, take it. I don't think there's any worries about that. And then now we push our other pawn, and we just hold station here. I think this is pretty much the same position. We'll wrap it up there. So you can see that even pushing the pawn didn't really help, just as long as black stayed on the corresponding squares. Okay, great. So that was just bringing Philidor into the corresponding squares equation, since he's obviously such a famous person in the history of pawn play. And I've used Aves once again to find this pawn study, and I highly recommend, if you're ever looking for pawn or any endgame type of studies, the Aves website is a great resource. Hope you enjoyed that, and thank you very much for watching.